I am Professor Ian Rotherham. I'm an ecologist and environmental and landscape historian, and I've been very involved in woodland studies for a very, very long time, and I think pioneered the idea of shadow woodlands and ghost woods and lost woods, which is part of my long-term interest in how landscapes change and where today's landscapes have come from historically and where they might be going in the future. And we talk about understanding the past so we know how we got to where we are now to inform the options for the future. So that's what really motivates me. Okay, one of the things which we discovered probably now scarily about 15 years ago was the idea of the origin of ancient woods. We were working with the Woodland Trust at the time on this, and we were looking at different ways to evidence what is an ancient woodland, because ancient woodlands have a certain amount of protection. And this led to the idea that the ancient woodlands, the indicator plants and various other things, got us back historically with confidence to what was a medieval wood. So this is a woodland whose origins were probably sometime either just before Doomsday, 1066, or in the 2 or 3 centuries afterwards. So we're looking at something like 900 to about 1300. And that was exciting. But then that raised the question, what was there before this was a wood? And to understand that, it's important to put yourself into a landscape and a social setting, an economy, a community that is dependent on its landscape. There's no trade, or very little trade. You are dependent on your local resources. And wood and timber are hugely important to you. And the population in countries like England was increasing through the period from about the Norman conquest up to about the 1400s. The climate was good, human population's increasing, and each manor, each parish is exhausting its resources. So they're moving out, they're clearing the wood, they're clearing the forest, and then suddenly they think, it's all gone. And if that goes, you can't nip next door, because the next door parish or manor will be very unhappy if you start trying to take their land and their resources. So you're living on what you can harvest locally. And they started to enclose the woodlands. So that all fitted into a pattern, and those woodlands which were enclosed and named the Manor Wood, the Lord's Wood, the King's Wood, etc., etc. If they survive today, they are our ancient woodlands, and that's fine. They're enclosed to keep animals out from grazing, and they're managed with a boom bust of the coppicing cycle and the timber cycle, which creates the conditions which we have in our ancient woodlands today. And that's why we have the fantastic bluebell woods and the wood anemone and things like that. However, something that we became intrigued about was where these woods had come from, and what we're finding in the wider landscape were the same indicators, often in smaller quantities, out on the open moorland, out on the fell side, on the edges of mountains. And in spring you go there, you can go into the Cumbrian fells and you'll see in spring bluebells and wood anemone extending up the fell sides. Not in a woodland, there's small trees, but not a woodland as we would recognise. And we started to realise that that was where these ancient woodlands had come from. They'd been enclosed from the wood pasture. And the wood pasture is different and distinctive from the general lowland wood pasture, which is usually the sort of ones with big trees like the Major Oak, Sherwood Forest, Mockers Park, the New Forest, etc. These were different and distinctive. These are upland wood pastures with small trees, little convoluted hollies and small multi-stemmed oak trees, little rowans which may be several centuries old. So very, very different, and they're not like the ones that we see in the lowlands. And then you look around and you find these patches of woodland plants. and you go out onto open heather moorland and you suddenly find a patch of wood anemone which shouldn't be there. You know, it's not read the book. It shouldn't be there at that altitude in that location. And then it's quite clear that these are what we call the shadows, the shadow woodlands from that doomsday wood pasture. So that was really exciting. And the fact is that if you come out where I live from Sheffield, you go up into the slopes of the Peak District, and as you go out in spring, you will see bluebells and stitchwort extending all the way up to the heather moorland. And you get some of the most fantastic species-rich, it's a terrible term, but scrubby habitat. And scrub, yeah, I have a problem with this because I'm passionate about two really exciting things, bogs and scrub, and the language doesn't work with me on it. But you get these really rich, scrubby habitats. And these are, we think, the vestiges, the remnants of the doomsday wood pastures. So they're still there, they're still species rich, and they are little bits which for various reasons never got enclosed. The 1800s, there's a massive movement called the enclosures, where a lot of upland areas are set aside for landowners and they are turned into grouse moor and sheep walk. And then if you go down the hill to the more productive land, the enclosures are happening and you get rectilinear field systems set out by land surveyors. Again, the commoners are pushed off the land and the land is enclosed as pasture or arable. And sometimes the two meet. If the two meet, then there's very little left. But what we did find, really exciting, is that there are some bits which don't meet, and the ancient landscape, the pre-doomsday landscape, the Saxon landscape, the Saxon countryside is still there. And it's been unrecognised. It's usually described as I say, in derogatory terms by ecologists as scrub and viewed as a transient feature, and it's not, it's long term, it goes back many, many centuries, it's been unrecognised, underappreciated. And the shadow woods are a manifestation of that. But we can also see these shadows in the landscape under the bracken, which are often, the bracken stands are often forming these pseudo canopies. They're like a pseudo woodland. They cast shade in the summer. That removes the competitive species from the ecology. That allows the spring flora of bluebells and stitchwort and honeysuckle and things like that to thrive just as they do in a woodland. So this is all really exciting stuff because the shadow woods can guide us in to where we need to unleash nature to let some of the trees come back. In some cases the trees are almost entirely gone. In other cases if you go up onto a crag where the trees have managed to escape grazing, or onto a boulder slope, what we call a clutter slope, or a scree slope, below the crags in the Dales or the Peak or in Cumbria, and you'll see trees hanging on there. They're often multi-stemmed, gnarled trees, and they're not very big, but then you go and look at them and you think, my God, these are really old. These are many, many centuries old, and we just haven't noticed. My mentor in this was a man called Professor Donald Piggott, who was at Lancaster when I was a student and then at Cambridge. And he identified above Coniston in the lakes small-leaved lime coppice trees in remote crags and remote gullies that have been dated as between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. Now that to me is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, those are the natural bits of woodland. There are other wildflowers associated with these relatively untouched, relatively ungrazed bits of ancient woodland. But those were 1,000 years old at the time of Christ, 2,000 years old at the Battle of Hastings. That's heritage. We don't recognise it as heritage at the moment, but it is heritage, and it tells a story. It tells a remarkable story of persistence in the Cumbrian landscape, and we need to capitalise on that.